The dispatcher's voice cut out mid-sentence, and that was the first thing that told me something was wrong. Not the silence itself, the way it stopped. Clean, like a wire pulled, not like a signal fading. When a radio signal dies naturally, it dies in stages. It crackles, it swims. The words go underwater and come back up a few times before they drown for good. This wasn't that. 1 second Ellison's voice was in my ear, flat and bored and midway through a word. And the next second, there was nothing. And the nothing had an edge to it, a squared-off quality, the sound of a thing being switched off rather than a thing running down. I was standing on the maintenance catwalk of the Pecos High Bridge at 4:52 in the afternoon, 320 feet above a dry riverbed, with a torque wrench in one hand and a two-way radio in the other. And I had just asked Ellison to confirm that the 6:10 freight out of Sanderson was still on schedule. Because if it wasn't, I needed to know before I climbed down into the deck trusses. You don't put your body inside a bridge with a train coming. That's the whole job, distilled. Know where the trains are, and never be where they're going to be. He never answered. I keyed the radio again. The push-to-talk button had that worn give-it-gets after a few years, spongy under the thumb. I called his name and let go and listened. Nothing but that dead air hiss you get when a channel is open, but nobody's holding it. A soft whitewash of static, steady, patient, going nowhere. Then I looked west, down the line, toward the long, straight run where you can see for 9 or 10 miles on a clear day in this part of West Texas. The afternoon was clear. The kind of clear you only get out here, where the air is so dry it seems to have no substance at all. Where distance stops meaning anything, and a mountain 40 miles off looks like you could walk to it before dinner. And that's when the second wrong thing landed on me. And it landed harder. There were supposed to be 2 trains on that stretch. The 5:40 out of Alpine, eastbound, which I'd watched pass under me 40 minutes earlier, close enough that I'd felt the whole bridge take the load and lean into it and let it go, the way it's supposed to, the way a healthy bridge breathes. And a light engine moved somewhere behind it, running solo. I'd tracked both on the board that morning, penciled them into the margin of my inspection log the way I always do. Because a bridge inspector who doesn't know where the trains are is a bridge inspector who becomes part of the ballast. They should have been sitting on that visible tangent of track, headlights on, the low sun behind them throwing long shadows off the ties. The track was empty, all the way to the horizon. No trains, no headlights, no dust hanging in the air where a train had just been. And out here, a train leaves a signature, a haze of kicked-up grit and diesel that hangs in the still afternoon for a good while after it's gone. There was none of that. No shimmer of heat off a hot engine. No glint of sun on steel. Nothing but rail and creosote ties and the wind. And the rail ran off into the west and grew thin and finally closed to a point the way parallel lines do. And along all of that distance, there was not one thing that a train had ever been. Trains don't disappear. I've worked this territory 19 years, and I have never once looked down a clear line and seen nothing where something should be. A train might be late. A train might be held. A train might be stopped for a hot box or a broken knuckle or a cow on the track. But a train that has passed you, going away from you, on straight and level ground you can see for 11 miles, does not simply cease to exist in the space of 40 minutes. There is no railroad reason for it. There is no physics for it. And I stood there on that catwalk, with the wrench going cold in my hand, and I felt, for the first time in a very long career of standing in dangerous places, that the thing under my feet had stopped making sense. Before I go any further, I want to say thank you to everyone who keeps coming back for these stories. And welcome if this is your first time on the channel. If this kind of slow burn survival story is what you're here for, subscribe and leave a comment as it plays, because it genuinely helps more people find these. Now let me tell you exactly what I found out on that bridge. My name is Reyes Alcott. I'm 49 years old, and I'm a bridge and structure inspector for the railroad that runs the old Sunset route across the Big Bend country. My job is to climb the things nobody thinks about until they fail. Trestles, viaducts, the deep truss bridges that span the arroyos out here where there's more sky than ground. I know the sound a good bridge makes, and the sound a bad one makes. A good bridge sings a little under load, a high tight note, steel doing exactly the work it was drawn to do. A bad bridge groans. It complains in a lower register, a wrongness you feel in your back teeth before you ever hear it with your ears. I know how to read a crack in a steel plate the way some men read a horse. Whether it's a surface thing that's been there since the plate was rolled, or a live thing that's growing a little every year, working toward the day it lets go. I am not a man who spooks. I want that clear from the start, because everything I'm about to tell you is going to sound like the ramblings of a man who spooked. And it wasn't. I was as calm as I've ever been. That's what made it worse. Fear I could have dismissed. This was calm, and calm noticing. And the thing it noticed was that the world had a hole in it. The Pecos High Bridge is a mile of steel, more or less. And on the afternoon this started, I was working a scheduled inspection on the east approach. I had driven out that morning in the company Ford, down 13 miles of ranch road off Highway 90, past the old ghost of Comstock, past a windmill that hadn't turned in years and a corral gone to gray splinters, and parked at the maintenance turnout on the east bank, where a gravel apron the railroad keeps clear runs down close to the abutment. My partner for the day was a younger man named Duval Crane, 31, a track inspector who'd been assigned to shadow me because the railroad wanted its people cross-trained. Duval was ambitious in the way young men are when they've decided the company is a ladder and not a job. Clean boots, always, even out here where a man's boots ought to look like they'd done something by noon. He kept them clean, wiped them on the running board when he thought nobody was looking. Always volunteering, always the first to say yes to the supervisor and the last to actually be useful when the supervisor wasn't watching. There's a certain kind of man who works hardest when he's being observed. And Duval was that kind. And I'd learned to keep him where I could see him, not out of dislike exactly, more the way you keep an eye on weather that hasn't decided what it's going to do yet. We'd been out there since 7. The day had been ordinary. And I want you to understand how ordinary, because the ordinariness is what makes the rest of it sit so strange in my memory. The morning had come up cool off the canyon and warmed fast. Hot for early spring by 10. A dry wind coming up out of Mexico across the border river, which you can see from the bridge on a good day. A green thread down in the canyon country, cottonwoods along the water and everything above them the color of old bone. We'd checked the east approach spans, the expansion bearings, the rivet lines. I'd found nothing worse than some scaling paint and one bearing that wanted grease. The only unusual thing all morning had been the radio traffic, or the lack of it. Dispatch in El Paso had been thin. Ellison, the dispatcher I dealt with, had mentioned around noon that half his desk had called in sick and the other half was chasing some kind of network problem. The automated systems throwing errors, the track warrant computers timing out. I didn't think about it. Railroads run on 100 small failures a day. A repeater drops, a crew oversleeps, a grade crossing sticks. You learn to route around them the way water routes around a stone, and you don't waste worry on any of it, because if you worried about every small failure, you'd never climb anything at all. So when Ellison went quiet at 4:52, my first thought wasn't horror. It was annoyance. I figured the repeater on the mesa had dropped, which happens in the heat. The equipment up there cooks all afternoon and sometimes just quits until dark cools it off. Or the batteries in my handheld were going, which also happens. They never hold the charge the spec sheet promises. I looked at the little bar on the radio's face and it showed full. That was a small thing, but I noticed it. Full battery, full signal indicator, and no signal. I called down to Duval. He was 200 feet away, up the track on the east approach, supposedly checking rail joints, walking the gauge with the measuring bar. He didn't answer either. I could see him, though. He was standing dead still between the rails, facing west, phone up to his ear. And even from that distance, I could read the set of his shoulders. He wasn't relaxed. He was rigid, drawn up tight, the phone pressed hard against the side of his head the way you press it when the person on the other end is saying something you don't want to have misheard. I climbed off the catwalk, back through the access hatch and up onto the deck, and walked the ties toward him. Walking ties is its own gait. You learn it or you break an ankle. The spacing never quite matches a natural stride, so you shorten up and watch your feet. And the whole time I was watching my feet, I could hear him talking, fast, low. The way you talk when you don't want to be overheard, but you're too scared to whisper properly. So the words come out in a rushed murmur that carries further than a whisper would. When he saw me, he jerked the phone down and put it in his vest pocket like a kid caught with something he shouldn't have. And there was a flush high on his cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "Who was that?" I said. "My sister, in Del Rio." He said it too quick, and his eyes went off to the side when he said it. Down the track, anywhere but at me. "Reyes, something's going on. She said the hospitals. She said people are..." She couldn't even, the line kept cutting out. "Something's going on where?" "Everywhere. She said everywhere." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, a dry mouth wipe, the kind a man does when his spit's gone thick with nerves. "Have you looked at your phone?" I hadn't. There's no cell service worth anything on the bridge. A bar if you're lucky and standing in exactly the right spot. And I keep mine in the truck because a phone in your pocket 300 feet up is a phone you're going to watch fall into a canyon someday. I told him that. And I told him the dispatcher had gone quiet. And I asked him a plain question. Because a plain question is the only tool I trust when a situation starts sliding sideways. "Where are the trains, Duval?" He didn't understand me at first. His face did that thing a face does when it's too full of one fear to make room for a new fact. Then he turned and looked west down that empty tangent the same way I had. And I watched him understand it. Watched the fact of it arrive in his face like a slow cold coming on. Because he'd seen those trains too. The 540 had passed under both of us. He'd waved at the engineer, I remembered. That little two-finger salute track men give. And now there was nothing there. And no reason for there to be nothing there. And I could see him reaching for a reason the way I'd reached for one, and coming up empty the same way. "They stopped somewhere," he said. "West, past the curve. There's no curve for 11 miles. You can see the whole tangent. A stopped train sits on the tangent. You'd see the markers, the ditch lights, the reflectors on the last car. There's nothing." Then they went back. Backed up 11 miles of single track without a dispatcher clearing it? Both of them. And the light engine behind them too. A reverse move like that takes authority. Takes 100 radio calls. Takes an hour just to set up. And they'd have had to pass right under us to do it. We'd have seen them. We'd have heard them. You don't back a mile of freight past two men on a bridge and have them miss it. He didn't have an answer, and neither did I. And the wind came up hard and cold off the canyon in a way spring wind out here does not usually do. Spring wind is warm, a dry oven breath that dries the sweat before it can cool you. This came up cold, off the water maybe, off the deep shade of the canyon, and it pushed at us with a weight to it, and it carried a smell I couldn't place, something faintly chemical under the creosote and the dust. And I felt the first genuine thread of unease work into me. Not fear yet. Just the sense that the ground I stood on, which I trusted, which I had spent 19 years learning to trust down to the pattern of the rivets, was doing something I couldn't account for. And that a man who can't account for the ground under his feet is a man who needs to get to ground he can. I made the practical decision, because practical is what I have instead of brave. We go to the truck. We get on the company phone, the vehicle unit, that runs off the truck battery and a real antenna, not this handheld. We get cell if we can climb the bank. We figure out what the actual situation is. This is probably a network cascade. Comms down division-wide, and they held the trains at Sanderson and Alpine out of caution, the way you're supposed to when you lose the ability to talk to your crews. That's procedure. That's ordinary. I didn't fully believe it. But a man says the ordinary thing out loud because saying it is a way of steering toward it, a way of telling your own nervous system to stand down. There's a rule for this. We know this one. We walked back east off the bridge together, and I remember the sound of our boots on the ballast once we were off the deck and onto the fill. That crunch and roll of crushed rock, and the wind. And underneath both of those, a new sound that I could not place at first. A low, layered noise coming from the direction of Highway 90, 13 miles off and out of sight behind the folded hills. It rose and fell, swelling and easing like something breathing, and it had no single source you could point at. It came from the whole northeast quarter of the sky. If you'd asked me to describe it, I'd have said it sounded like a highway at rush hour. That steady oceanic drone of 1,000 engines, all running at once. The sound you hear standing on an overpass above an interstate in a city. Except there is no rush hour on Highway 90. It's a 2-lane blacktop through empty country. On a heavy day, you might see 40 cars an hour. And you'd hear each one come and each one go, a distinct thing with a beginning and an end. The drone I was hearing had no beginnings and no ends. It was the sound of hundreds, maybe more. All of them out there at once, all of them moving. And the fact that I couldn't see a single one of them behind those hills made it worse, made it into a kind of weather rather than a thing with a cause. We reached the turnout at 5:20. The truck was where we'd left it, white and dust-filmed on the gravel apron, tilted a little on the uneven ground. My phone was on the seat where I'd left it, face down, and when I turned it over, it was lit up like a slot machine. 41 missed messages stacked on the lock screen. The little number in the red circle almost comic in how high it had climbed. The newest was a mass alert from the county, the kind that overrides your ringer and buzzes whether you want it or not. And I read it standing in the open door of the truck with the wind pulling at the paper of the inspection log clipped to the visor, making it chatter against the plastic. And the message was 6 words long, and it changed the shape of the rest of my life. Shelter in place. Do not travel. Below it, an older message. Time-stamped 3:40. From the railroad's own emergency line. An automated system I'd never seen trigger in 19 years. Not for floods. Not for the wildfire that closed the Sanderson subdivision for a week one summer. Never. It instructed all field personnel to proceed to the nearest company facility with power and shelter and to remain there until contacted. It named the facilities by division, a whole list of them. And I scrolled it with my thumb. And for our territory, this stretch of the Del Rio subdivision, there was exactly one. And I knew it well, because I'd inspected the water tower behind it 2 summers back, and spent 3 days working off that structure in the heat, so I knew the building and the ground around it as well as I knew any place on the line. The Pumpville Relay Depot. A cinder block signal maintenance building beside the tracks about 9 miles west, built in the 60s, squat and ugly and honest. With its own diesel generator, a drilled well with an electric pump, a bunk room for stranded crews from back when crews still got stranded out here regularly, and steel roll-down shutters on every window because the railroad had learned long ago that anything left unattended in this country gets shot at or stolen or both. It was the one hard structure for 40 miles in any direction. Cinder block walls you couldn't kick through, a flat concrete roof, a steel door, and it sat right beside the tracks where the trains had vanished. 9 miles into the empty west. The direction everything in me was telling me not to go. And the direction the railroad and the county between them were now ordering me toward. Duval was reading over my shoulder, close enough that I could hear him breathing. And he read the drone on the highway too. I could see him hearing it. His head cocked toward the northeast, and he said the thing we were both thinking. We can't drive out on 90. Whatever that noise is, that's people. That's a lot of people. And if the county's saying don't travel, then the road's the worst place to be. We'd be driving right into the middle of it. He was right. It was the only correct read he made all day. And I'll give him that. I'll give the man his one clear moment. The road wasn't an option. 13 miles of ranch road to reach a highway that had turned into that sound, which left us one place to go, west, along the tracks, toward the empty line and the vanished trains, and the one building the railroad itself was telling us to run too, toward Pumpville. I want to explain why we went, because from the outside, it looks insane to walk toward the place where the trains disappeared. But you have to understand how a railroader thinks, how 19 years builds a set of instincts into a man that override the ordinary fears. The track was the only surface I trusted absolutely. I knew every foot of it between the bridge and Pumpville. I knew where the culverts ran under the fill, where the cattle guards crossed, where the grade dropped into a cut deep enough that a man walking the bottom of it couldn't be seen from anywhere off the right-of-way. The track was a private corridor cut through country that belonged to no one, fenced on both sides, and it led to shelter, water, power, and walls. The highway, 13 miles the other way, led to whatever was making that ocean sound of engines. It wasn't a hard choice when you laid it out. It was the only choice a man who knew the ground would make. We took what we could carry from the truck, and we took it methodically because panic makes you leave the water and grab the flashlight. And I've seen it, and I made us slow down and do it right. 2 full-gallon jugs of water from the case behind the seat. My inspection pack, which is a good pack, canvas and hard-worn, with tools and a headlamp and spare batteries and a first aid kit that's more than the little tin most men carry. Because a bridge man works alone in high places and learns to be his own ambulance. Duval's pack, lighter, mostly his lunch and his rain gear. A box of granola bars somebody had left in the cab, and that I'd been meaning to throw out for a month, now suddenly worth their weight in silver. Both radios, the handhelds, dead as they were, because a dead radio might not be dead everywhere. And the shotgun the company issues to field crews for wildlife. A plain Remington pump 12 gauge that rode in a rack behind the seat, with a partial box of shells in the door pocket, buckshot and slugs mixed, maybe 11 rounds total. I counted them. I carried the gun and the shells. Not because I expected to use it, but because a man carrying a gun makes calmer decisions than a man wishing he had one. And I wanted every ounce of calm I could get my hands on. We started walking at 5:40. and I noticed the time on the truck's clock as I shut the door. And the coincidence sat in me cold, because 5:40 was the exact minute the vanished train should have been rolling under a bridge somewhere to the east. Right on the schedule I'd penciled in that morning. The sun was dropping toward the mesa, gone soft and orange. The light coming in low and level so that every rock and bush threw a shadow 10 times its length. And our own shadows stretched out ahead of us down the rails, long and thin and reaching, pointing the way west like they knew where we were going before we did. The first 2 miles were nothing, just walking. And the strange gift of walking is that it quiets the mind, gives it a rhythm to hang on to. The track ran dead straight along the top of a low fill, mesquite and creosote bush on both sides gone gray-green in the evening. The canyon country off to the south, dropping away in ledges toward the river. We didn't talk much. Duval kept trying his phone, holding it up over his head, turning slow circles, watching the bars. And I let him, because a man needs something to do with his hands when he's scared. The bars died completely around the first mile marker and never came back. And after that, he put the phone away. And I think losing that last thread to the world outside did something to him. Some hope going out. The company radio gave us nothing on any channel. I cycled through all of them twice, thumbing the selector, keying and listening, keying and listening. Dead air on everyone except Channel 3, the dispatch channel, which still carried that open hiss, that held-open silence, as if somewhere a microphone was keyed and nobody was speaking into it. I found that more disturbing than pure silence would have been. Silence is a channel closed, a man gone home, a system shut down for the night. That hiss was a channel someone had opened and then left. A dead man's switch, my mind kept saying, though I told it to hush. Somewhere a hand had pressed the button, and then something had happened to the hand, and the button had stayed down. Around 6:15 we came on the first thing. It was a rail car. A single covered hopper, the tall kind that hauls grain or plastic pellets, riding high on its trucks, sitting alone on the main line with no engine and no other cars, just standing there on the straight track in the last of the light, as if it had been set down out of the sky by something with no reason to explain itself. I stopped 100 feet short of it and put my hand out to stop Duval, too. A loose car on a main line is a serious thing, a wrong thing, a thing the entire safety architecture of a railroad exists to prevent. It means a train broke apart, or was broken apart, and there are a dozen automatic systems designed to make the first impossible. Cars are chained together with automatic couplers that lock steel to steel, and joined by air hoses that run the brake line down the length of the train. And the whole thing is engineered so that if a train comes apart, the brakes slam on automatically, everywhere, all at once. You do not just lose one car and leave the rest rolling. Somebody uncoupled it, Duval said, and his voice was low, like the car might hear him. Or it was left. I walked up on it slow, my boots quiet as I could make them on the ballast, the shotgun down along my leg. The handbrake was set. I could see the wheel cranked hard over at the end platform, the chain drawn tight, which meant a human being had climbed up onto that platform and put his back into it and secured the car deliberately, the way you're taught, the way you'd never bother to do if you were fleeing something. The air hose on the west end was hanging loose, the glad hand fitting disconnected clean, capped even, not torn, not ripped away in a break-in too. On the east end, the same. Somebody had cut this car out of a train, tied its brakes, capped its lines, and walked away, and had done it in the proper order, calm, unhurried, a trained man doing a trained task. I looked at the numbers stenciled on the side, white paint on the rust-brown steel, and I recognized the reporting mark. the little abbreviation that tells a railroader who owns a car and where it lives. It was one of ours. It belonged, or should have belonged, to a train that was somewhere else, to the 540, to one of the trains that wasn't there. So the train hadn't vanished. It had been taken apart, piece by piece, somewhere west of here, by people who knew how to set a handbrake and cap an air hose in the right order, which is not knowledge the average frightened person has. Railroaders, crews, which meant the crews were alive, or had been recently, and had done something deliberate and skilled with their trains. And the only reason I could think of to strip a train down to single cars strung out along a main line is if you wanted to block that line against something, or if you were using the cars for something else. Cover, walls, a barricade 100 tons at a time. I climbed up on the hopper's end platform to get height and look west, my boots ringing on the grating. And from up there, maybe a mile and a half on, I could see them. More cars, strung out along the track in ones and twos and threes, some still coupled together, most standing alone. A scatter of them down the straight line like a train that had been picked up and shaken and dropped where it fell. And beyond the cars, small in the failing light, the shape of the Pumpville depot. Low and square, its water tower a black finger against the last orange in the west, and a thread of gray smoke rising straight up from behind it in the still evening air, straight up because the wind had died with the sun the way it does out here. Smoke meant people. People meant the crews, or survivors, or both, holed up in the one hard building the railroad had told us to go to. It should have been a pure relief, and part of me did feel it. The animal part that had spent the last hour and a half feeling like the last two men alive in the whole Big Bend country. Here was proof I wasn't. Here were people and fire and the ordinary human business of cooking a meal. But something about that smoke was wrong, and it took me a moment up there on the platform to work out what. It was cooking smoke, small and controlled, a careful fire, not a signal fire, and not a building burning. And a depot full of stranded crews, 40 or 50 men with a company emergency directive telling them to shelter in place, would have the lights on, the generator running. That building had floodlights mounted on the eaves that lit the whole yard, bright as a ball field. I'd worked under them once when a job ran past dark. It was near full dark now, the first stars pricking out overhead. There was not one light showing anywhere in that direction. No floods, no window glow bleeding around the edges of a shutter. Nothing. Just a locked-down black building with a small, careful fire tucked behind it where its light wouldn't carry. And the shutters, I would have bet money, rolled down tight over every window. People who light no lamps after dark are people who don't want to be seen, and people who don't want to be seen have learned, recently and hard, that being seen is dangerous. I climbed down and told Duval what I'd seen. The cars and the depot and the smoke in the dark, keeping my voice flat, just reporting it, the way I'd report a defect. And I watched him take it in. And this is the moment I keep going back to, the one I turn over in my hands at night. Because looking at it now, with everything I know, I think this was where he started to change. Or more likely where the thing that was always in him started to show itself, the way a hairline crack shows itself only under load. He didn't ask about the survivors. He didn't say, thank God, other people were saved. None of the things a frightened man says when he learns he isn't alone. The first thing out of his mouth was a question about the building. And it was a cold question, an accountant's question. How many can it hold? The bunk room, the depot? I don't know exactly. 6 bunks, maybe 8. Floor space for more. Why? Because if there's a lot of them already, and it's the only shelter for 40 miles, then they're not going to want 2 more mouths walking in. He said it flat, working the problem out loud the way I'd work out a load rating. Think about it. Water from one well, whatever food they scavenged off the trains. That's a fixed amount, Reyes. It doesn't grow. Every single person who walks through that door makes everybody else's share smaller. That's just math. That's not me being cold, that's arithmetic. I remember I stopped and looked at him in the near dark, and I couldn't see his face well, just the pale shape of it. But I could hear him fine. We're the 2 mouths in that sentence, I said. You and me. We're the people you're worried about them not wanting. I'm just saying we should think about how we come in, what we say, what we offer, that's all. He shrugged, and the shrug had a defensiveness in it. There's nothing wrong with thinking ahead. I didn't like it, and something in me wanted to press it, but I didn't argue, because we were losing the last of the light and losing warmth fast this way the desert loses it. 40 degrees in an hour once the sun's gone. And the drone from the highway had faded behind the hills into a low murmur. And I wanted walls around me before it got fully dark, and before I couldn't see my own feet on the ties. So we kept walking, west along the tracks, threading between the abandoned rail cars now. And the closer we got to the depot, the more the scene made sense, and the less I liked what it said. Because a thing that makes sense in that country usually makes the kind of sense you'd rather not understand. The cars weren't scattered randomly. Once I was down among them, I could read the intention in them plain as a signature. 2 hoppers and a boxcar had been shoved together end to end across the mouth of the depot's access road, sealing off the only vehicle way in from the ranch road and Highway 90 beyond it, a steel plug in the one gap in the terrain. Another string of cars, 5 or 6 of them, ran along the north side of the building, coupled up into a solid line. A wall 2 stories high of nothing but freight steel standing between the depot and the open country where the highway lay off to the northeast. Somebody had built a fort out of a stopped train. Somebody who understood that a 100-ton loaded rail car is the closest thing to a castle wall a man can get for free in this country. That you can't push it, can't tip it, can't shoot through it. That it just stands there being a wall better than any wall you could build with your hands in a year. And who had decided that whatever was coming from the direction of that engine drone, was worth the labor and worth the walling out. We came up on the east end of the barricade around 7 o'clock, full dark now, cold enough that our breath showed. The stars come out hard and thick and bright the way they only do this far from any town. So many of them that the sky had a gray wash to it. The Milky Way standing up clear across the whole of it. There was a gap in the line of cars. A single boxcar rolled just far enough down the rail to leave a space maybe a man's width. And standing in that gap, backlit by nothing at all, because there was no light anywhere behind it, was the silhouette of a person with a rifle held at low ready, the barrel down, but the stance ready. A stance I recognized. A trained stance. "That's far enough," the silhouette said. A woman's voice, older, dry as the country, with the particular flat authority of somebody who has spent a long career telling men what to do and being obeyed without having to raise her voice about it. "You stop right there. You armed?" "Shotgun," I said, and I said it clear and unhurried, because a nervous person with a rifle is a danger, and I didn't want to be a surprise to her. "Company gun, 12 gauge. This is my track partner, Duval Crane. I'm Reyes Alcott, bridge inspector. We got the shelter order off the emergency line this afternoon. We walked in from the Pecos Bridge, 13 miles east, 9 on the track." A pause. I could feel her measuring us in the dark, the shapes of us, the way we stood. "Say your reporting number." Your employee number. Slow. I said it. All 6 digits, slow and clear. The number that's on my badge and my paychecks and my whole 19 years. And I heard her exhale. A long breath let out through the nose, and the rifle came down from the ready, the barrel dropping to point at the ballast. "All right," she said. "You're railroad then, or you learned the number off a dead man, and I'll choose to believe the first one tonight. Come in slow, both of you, hands where I can see them, and when you're through this gap, you set that shotgun down inside the door, and you don't pick it back up unless I say so. That's the rule for everybody in here, no exceptions, and we've got no arguments about it, and we're not going to start having them for you. You want in out of the cold, that's the price. Guns live by the door, and they belong to all of us." "That's fair," I said. And it was. And it was more than fair. It was the mark of somebody who'd thought hard about how 16 frightened strangers stay alive in one room. And we went in. Her name was Odessa Ray. She was 58 years old, a retired locomotive engineer who'd pulled trains across this division for 30 years before she hung it up. And she'd been riding the 540 that afternoon as a deadhead passenger, meaning she was catching a free ride east in the cab as a company courtesy, on her way to her granddaughter's quinceañera in Sanderson. She had the build of somebody who'd spent 30 years climbing on and off locomotives, thick through the shoulders, and a face gone deep-lined from the sun through a windshield, and eyes that didn't move around when she talked to you. They just settled on you and stayed. When the emergency alert had come through and the dispatcher had gone dark and the road ahead of the train had turned into whatever it turned into, she was the one who'd made the crews stop, cut the trains apart, and build the wall. She'd done it because she was the oldest railroader on that train, and everybody deferred to her by long instinct, and because she'd survived a derailment in 1994 that killed 2 men she'd known, and it had left her with a very simple philosophy, which she told me that first night. Sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in the dark depot with the rifle laid across her knees and a single stub of candle burning in a coffee can between us. "When the system quits telling you what to do," she said, "you stop waiting for it to start again. That's the whole trick. Most people freeze because they're waiting on the announcement, the all clear, the voice on the radio that says, 'Here's what happens next.' There's no voice coming, so you stop waiting. And you look at what you've actually got in your 2 hands, and you build something out of it. The system's a tool, a good one when it works, but it's a tool. It's not your mother, and it's not going to come back and tuck you in." I've thought about those words more than I've thought about almost anything else in my life. And I'll tell you why later, because they turned out to cut 2 ways, and the second way nearly killed us all. Inside the depot, there were 14 people. Not 50, the way I'd braced myself for. 14. Odessa, 4 crew members off the 2 trains, 2 engineers and 2 conductors, and 9 others. A mix that told the story of an afternoon when the whole country tried to run at once. There was a rancher named Boone Tillery, weathered and slow-spoken, who'd walked in off his own land 2 miles north with his teenage son when he'd climbed a rise to see what the noise was and seen the highway filled bumper to bumper with cars that weren't moving right. There was a Border Patrol agent, off-duty, who'd been driving home and gotten caught in it and abandoned her truck. There was a retired schoolteacher named Fen Kessler, a passenger off the 540, 70-some years old with a bad hip and a cane, and a mind sharper than anybody's in the building. And a handful of others, a young couple, a trucker, a woman who'd been visiting the grave of somebody at the little cemetery up the road. 14 people, 1 drilled well, a generator they were running only 2 hours a day to save the fuel, and food they'd pulled off a single refrigerated car that had been hauling produce and frozen goods east toward the cities. It wasn't a lot. It wasn't nearly enough. And Odessa hadn't hidden that from anybody. She'd done the math out loud, in front of everyone, on a whiteboard bolted to the wall of the main room. The kind of whiteboard a signal maintainer uses to track his work. And she'd wiped off whatever railroad business had been on it, and written the survival math up where everybody could see it and check it and own it. At the current ration, she'd written, the food lasted 11 days. The generator fuel at 2 hours a day lasted 9. The well was the only thing they had in real supply. Cold, clean water 50 feet down. And the cruel joke of it was that the well needed the generator to pump it. So the water and the fuel were chained together. And when the fuel ran out, the water might as well be on the moon. 9 days of power, 11 days of food, 14 people. And now with Duval and me standing dripping cold in the doorway, 16. I saw Duval look at that whiteboard. I saw his eyes go to it the moment we were inside, before he looked at a single human face. And I saw him do the arithmetic he'd been doing out loud on the track. 2 more mouths. 9 days becomes fewer. 11 days becomes fewer. He didn't say anything this time. He'd learned that much, at least. Learned to keep the cold thoughts behind his teeth in a room full of people who'd built a fort together. But I saw it land in him. Saw his jaw work. And I filed it away. And God forgive me, I did nothing but file it. Because I was cold and tired and grateful for walls. And I told myself a man is allowed his private fears as long as he keeps his hands honest. I didn't yet know that his hands were the problem. What had happened out west, past the empty tangent, past the vanished trains, was this. And Odessa laid it out for me over the next day or two as I earned my place in that building, because I did earn it. I'm not too proud to say I worked for those people like a rented mule those first days to make up for being 2 extra mouths at the table. The trains had stopped because the crews got the same alert we did, the shelter in place, plus something worse and more specific. The 540's conductor, a quiet man named Aldo, had a brother on the Alpine police force, and the brother had gotten 1 call out before the whole network died, and the call had been about the sick. It had started days before, apparently, in the cities, El Paso and Odessa, and the towns strung along the interstate. Some illness that moved through a crowd, faster than anybody could credit, and did something to people that Aldo's brother, by all accounts, a hard, practical man, who'd seen everything a border cop sees, could only describe by saying, "They don't stop, and they don't know you." That was the phrase that went around the depot in those first days and never lost its power to quiet a room. They don't stop, and they don't know you. Nobody pressed Aldo for more, and Aldo didn't offer more. And I think the reason was that more would have made it real in a way that none of us could carry yet. The engine drone we'd heard on the highway was the cities emptying out. Everyone who could drive was driving, west and south, out of the towns and toward the open country, toward the border, toward anywhere that wasn't a city full of the thing that didn't stop. And some fraction of them carried the sickness with them. And it spread wherever the crowds pooled up. And the crowds pooled up worst exactly where they got stuck. At the checkpoints and the choke points and the 2-lane roads that couldn't hold them. Highway 90 was a 2-lane road. The county alert to shelter in place had been the county government's last coherent act before it stopped issuing alerts at all. Before the last dispatcher keyed his microphone and left it keyed and walked away, or worse. The railroaders had done the only thing 30 years of training built into people like them. When in doubt, protect the corridor. Stop the trains, secure them, make the line safe, and wait for the system to come back with instructions. Except this time, the system wasn't coming back. And Odessa had been the first one to say it out loud. Standing in the cab looking at a dead radio and a highway going wrong in the distance. And that's why they'd turned 2 stop trains into a fort instead of just parking them and waiting. They weren't waiting anymore. That was the whole of it. The waiting had ended somewhere out on that line, and the surviving had begun. And I'd walked in right at the seam between the two, the days after we arrived, settled into a shape. And I'll be honest with you. There was a stretch there, maybe 5 days, where the depot at Pumpville was the closest thing to safe I'd felt since the dispatcher went quiet on the bridge. We had walls, real ones, cinder block and freight steel. We had a rhythm. Odessa ran the place the way she'd run a train crew. Everybody with a job and a shift. The watches split so the gaps in the wall were covered around the clock, the water hauled and boiled. The food weighed out on a little postal scale somebody had found in the depot office. Weighed to the gram and handed out. And nobody, not once in those first days, got more than his share, because Odessa handed it out herself. And Odessa didn't have favorites. I took the overnight watch on the East Gap, the same gap we'd walked in through, because I don't sleep well anyway, and never have. And because standing in the dark listening to a stretch of empty country is a thing I know how to do. It's half of my whole career. You learn the normal sounds of a place at night, and then you listen for the sound that isn't normal. And that skill, it turned out, was worth as much in that gap as it ever was on a bridge. Duval took the day watches, when the light meant less could go wrong, and there were more eyes around. The rancher, Boone Tillery, and his boy, whose name was Wade, kept the generator and the well. Boone being the kind of man who could fix most anything with a wrench and a patient temperament. Fen Kessler, the teacher with a bad hip who couldn't stand a watch or haul water, made himself useful with his mind. And it was Fen who kept the count, who took over the whiteboard from Odessa and tallied every ration and every liter. And it was Fen who first noticed that the food was going faster than the math said it should. That's the thread I want you to hold on to, because it's the one that pulls everything else apart. If you've ever been in a group where the supplies didn't add up and nobody wanted to be the one to say the ugly thing out loud, tell me in the comments how that went, and where you're listening from, because I have never once forgotten how it felt to watch it happen in that room. Fen kept the count because his hip meant he couldn't do the heavy work. And a man like that, a proud man, a man who'd stood in front of classrooms for 40 years and been the authority in the room, finds a way to be useful with his mind or he withers. And Fen found his way. He counted every can, every retort pouch, every foil-wrapped ration bar, every liter jug. And he wrote the totals on the board each night in a schoolteacher's careful hand. And around the 6th day, he came to me on the overnight watch, moving slow and quiet on his cane over the gravel. And he lowered himself down onto the bucket beside me with a grunt. And he said the numbers were off. Not by a lot, a little each day. 2 ration packs here that the tally couldn't account for, a can of peaches there that had been on the shelf at the evening count and gone by morning. A liter or 2 of the boiled water vanished from the jug faster than the posted shift schedule could explain. He'd thought at first he was miscounting. He was old, he said plainly, without self-pity, and tired. And a tired old man makes mistakes. So he'd started marking the cans. A tiny dot from a carpenter's pencil on the top rim of each lid, where you'd never see it unless you knew to look, and he'd count the dots. And cans with dots on them were disappearing between the evening count and the morning count. "Somebody's skimming," he said. His voice was low and even, no drama in it. A man reporting a fact. "Somebody in this building is taking more than their share and hiding it away. And they're being careful about it, which is the part I don't like. A hungry person grabs. This is somebody planning." I told him to keep it to himself and keep counting, and to keep those marks a secret, because in a locked building with 16 frightened people, an accusation is a struck match, and you do not strike a match near a group that's already sitting close to the edge of burning. I told him we'd find out who, quietly, and we'd handle it quietly, the way Odessa handled everything. And that the worst thing we could do was turn 16 scared people into 16 suspicious people, all watching each other instead of the wall. He agreed. He was a good man, Fen Kessler, a careful and a decent man. And I want you to hold that in your mind. And 2 days later, he was dead. And I want to be very careful how I tell you this, because it matters. It matters more than anything else in the whole of what happened. That Fen Kessler did not die because any single person laid a hand on him. Nobody touched him. That's not the kind of story this is. This is a colder kind. Here's what happened. On the 8th day, the generator failed. Not out of fuel. We still had 2 days of diesel by the board's reckoning. It seized. It threw a rod, some hard mechanical death down in the guts of the old engine. And it died in the middle of its evening run with a bang and a shudder, and then a silence worse than the bang. And just like that, the well pump lost its power and stopped drawing, and the water stopped coming up out of the ground. There were maybe 14 liters of boiled water standing in the jugs, and no way to make more. Not without power to lift it 50 feet up out of the earth. Boone Tillery went at that engine for an hour by lamplight, and he was a good mechanic. But he came out from behind it wiping his hands on a rag with a look on his face I didn't like. And he shook his head at Odessa. And she called everyone together in the main room, all 16 of us, packed in close in the light of 2 headlamps hung from nails. And she laid it out flat the way she always did, no softening. The generator was dead, she said, and it wasn't coming back, not without a part Boone couldn't make. But there was a spare fuel pump and a spare starter motor and a box of other parts in the storage cage at the back of the depot, railroad supply, kept for exactly this kind of trouble. And there was a second generator, a small portable unit, a Honda, gas, not diesel, in that same cage, locked up because the cage was always locked. Enough, maybe, cobbled together, to get the well pumping again, long enough to fill every jug and pot and bottle in the building, to buy back the water they'd just lost. The key to that cage lived on a ring that Odessa had kept on her belt since the first day, and that she had handed to Duval Crane 2 days before, because Duval had volunteered, eager, helpful, first to raise his hand, to do a full inventory of the parts in the cage so they'd know exactly what they had if the generator ever went down. She turned to him now and put out her hand. "Duval, the cage key." And Duval Crane said he'd lost it. I remember the room going very still, the kind of still where you can hear the candle. Odessa didn't raise her voice. She never once raised her voice the whole time I knew her. She just looked at him across the 2 headlamps worth of light. And she let the quiet stretch a second and she said, "When?" "Yesterday. Maybe the day before. I had it on the watch and I think it came off the ring somehow. I've been looking, Odessa. I swear I've been looking. I've been all over the yard for it." The words came tumbling. Too many of them, too fast, tripping over each other. I didn't want to say anything until I'd found it. I figured I'd find it. It's got to be right here somewhere. And I'd heard him talk like that exactly once before. On the track, at the very start of all this, with the phone pressed against his ear, telling me about his sister in Del Rio. That same too fast, too smooth rush of words, the eyes going off to the side, the flush coming up. I knew the sound of Duval Crane lying. I'd heard it on the first afternoon, and I'd filed that away too. And now the file opened up in my head all at once, and I felt the floor of my stomach drop. Boone Tillery said he could break the lock. It was a heavy padlock on a length of chain through the cage door's hasp, and given time and the right tools, he'd have it off. It took him the rest of what daylight leaked around the shutters, and then some. Working with a pry bar and the hacksaw out of my inspection pack, the blade shrieking against the shackle. Everyone taking turns because the work was slow. And when the chain finally rattled loose and fell and the cage door swung open on its dry hinge, we all crowded up to look, because that cage was the whole difference now between water and no water, between living out the week and not. And this is the part I will see behind my eyes until the day I die. The cage was empty, not of everything. The parts were there, the fuel pump and the starter, sitting on the shelf where the inventory said they'd be. But the portable generator, the Honda, the one machine that could have pulled water back out of that well, was gone. Just gone. A clean rectangle in the dust on the floor where it had stood. And the shelf along the back wall. The shelf where Odessa had quietly stored the deep reserve. The real cushion. The sealed cases of drinking water and the dense high-calorie emergency rations that she'd held back from the very first day, and never once written on the whiteboard, because she wanted a margin that nobody could see and nobody could spend in a panic. That shelf was bare, wiped clean. Somebody had been coming into that cage with the key night after night and carrying the reserve out of it a can and a pouch and a liter at a time, slow, patient, careful, and hiding it somewhere. And now, on the very night the generator died, the portable that could have saved us was gone too. Odessa turned to Duval very slowly, and I watched her face change, watched something close down in it. "You didn't lose the key," she said. "You've had it in your pocket the whole time. You've been in this cage every night." And Duval Crane, 31 years old, clean boots even now, first to volunteer, looked around that tight circle of desperate faces in the light of 2 headlamps. And I watched him make a decision, watched him decide to stop pretending. And I saw the change come over him, like a shadow moving across ground. And what he said was worse than any lie could have been. "There's not enough for 16, he said. And his voice had gone steady. The panic that had made the words tumble a minute ago was just gone, drained out of him. And what came up underneath it was flat and level and cold. And somehow that was the most frightening thing I'd seen or heard since the bridge. "There was never enough for 16. Odessa, you did the math yourself. On that board, everybody in this room watched you do it. 11 days of food, 9 of fuel. And that was before Reyes and I even walked in and made it worse. You want to be angry at somebody, be angry at the numbers. I just read them honestly. I'm not going to stand here and apologize for planning ahead when nobody else in this room had the stomach to." "Where is it, Duval?" Odessa's voice hadn't changed at all. That was the terrible thing. She asked it the way she'd ask a crewman where he'd left a tool. "Somewhere the whole group can't burn through it in a week the way you've been burning through everything else." And then he looked at me, of all people, straight at me across that circle, like he expected me, specifically, to be the one who understood. "You taught me this, Reyes. The first day, out on the line. You said it yourself, or Odessa said it, and you agreed. I don't even remember which of you anymore. But you both said the same thing. The system's not your mother. When it quits, you stop waiting. You look at what you've got, and you build something out of it. That's it. That's all I did. I looked at what we've got, and I saw the honest truth that it isn't enough. And I built myself a way through it. You'd have done the same. Every single person standing in this cage would have done the same if they'd had the nerve to see it first." Nobody spoke. The wind, come back up after dark, pushed at the steel shutters and made them tick against their frames. Somewhere back in the dark of the depot, Boone Tillery's boy, Wade, made a small sound, a scared kid sound he was too old to want to have made, and cut it off. I want to tell you I stayed calm, and I've told you all through this that I'm a man who doesn't spook, and it's true. But there's a difference between fear and the thing that came up in me looking at that empty shelf. And I want to name it right, because it wasn't panic. It was understanding. It was the whole shape of the trap arriving in my mind all at once. Because it wasn't just theft. Theft, you could survive. You could ration harder, tighten belts, go hungry and live. It was the timing of it, the machine of it. The diesel generator had died today, tonight, this hour. And the portable that could have replaced it, that could have put water back in our hands, was gone. Taken by him, hidden by him out in that black country somewhere. Which meant we now had 14 liters of water for 16 people in a hot cinder block building, and no way under heaven to make one drop more. And Fen Kessler, who had a bad hip and a bad heart, and needed more water than a younger man just to keep his body running. Fen, who had quietly given part of his own ration away twice that I personally knew of. To Boone's boy the first time, and to the young pregnant woman the second, was standing at the edge of that circle with his lips gone gray and his breathing coming shallow and wrong, because the shortage had already started taking the weakest of us first, the way a shortage always does. And there was no fixing it now. Not tonight. Not with the cage empty and the reserve out in the dark, and the man who'd hidden it standing there, telling us it was arithmetic. Fen Kessler died 2 days later. Quietly, in his sleep, on a bunk in the back room, sometime in the coldest part of the night, and one of the crewmen found him in the morning, already gone cold. A county coroner, if there'd been a county left with a coroner in it, would have written down whatever they write for an old man with a bad heart and a bad hip who died of dehydration in a hot building with a dead generator. Natural causes, contributing factors, but I know what killed Fen Kessler. I know it to the day and the hour and the exact square foot of concrete floor. It was that empty shelf in that cage. It was the reserve that would have kept every one of us in water for another week, carried off can by can into the dark by a young man who'd decided, alone, with a key nobody knew he still had, that some of the people in that building mattered and some of them didn't, and had done the arithmetic and had put himself firmly on the side that lived. That was the ticking clock he built for us. Not a bomb, not a fire, nothing you could point at and call violence. Just subtraction, done quietly, in the dark, over 8 nights. He took the margin. And in a place like Pumpville, the margin is the whole thing. The margin is the exact distance between everybody lives and somebody doesn't. And he had carried the margin off into the country 1 liter at a time. And by the time we broke the lock and saw the empty shelf, the clock had already been running 8 days, and we simply hadn't been able to see the face of it to know what time it was. Here's the thing I have to tell you about that night, and it's the thing I'm least proud of and least ashamed of at the very same time, which is a hard and narrow place for a man to have to live. And I've lived there a long while now. Odessa put it to the group as a decision. She was that kind of leader all the way down to the bone. She didn't rule people, she ran a crew. And a crew, when it comes to the hard things, votes. She said there were 2 things that had to be decided, and they had to be decided that night by everyone, out loud. First, what we did about the water, right now, before morning. And second, what we did about Duval Crane. The water we handled the way you handle any emergency once the first shock of it burns off, and the training comes back up through the fear. We tore the depot apart looking for what he'd hidden. Every locker, every crawl space, the space above the drop ceiling in the office, under the bunks, and we didn't find one can of it, because he'd been cleverer than to hide it in the building where a search would turn it up. He'd cached it outside, out in the dark, somewhere in the miles of scrub and dry tanks. And he would not say where, not that night, not the next day, not ever fully. But Boone Tillery, who could not sit still with a problem in front of him, who went back to the dead generator and kept working it. Not because he thought he'd fix it, but because his hands needed something honest to do, found that the seized old engine could give up one small mercy. He drained a few liters of clean water out of the cooling system's overflow tank. Water that had gone in fresh and never circulated through the block, never touched the oil. And it wasn't much, it was a few liters, but it was a few liters, and it bought us a day. And Renata Solano, the Border Patrol agent, who had been just about the quietest person in that whole building for a week, who'd stood her watches and eaten her ration and said almost nothing, spoke up then for the first time that mattered. And she said she knew this country. She'd patrolled every arroyo of it for years, and that there was a stock tank and a windmill on the Tillery Ranch, 2 miles north. And a windmill doesn't need a generator. A windmill needs wind. And out here there is always wind. It was outside the wall. It meant crossing 2 miles of open ground in the direction of the highway and whatever the highway had become. But it was water that pumped itself out of the earth on the strength of the sky, and it changed everything. And it is the reason any one of us is alive, to have this told. But it's that second decision I keep coming back to, in the dark, on the watches I still stand out of habit even now. What to do about Duval? Because here is the trap folded inside the trap. He'd taken the margin, and people were going to suffer and die for it. Fenn already was dying for it, even as we argued, though we didn't quite know it yet. But Duval Crane was also one of only 2 people in that whole building who could stand a watch alone in the dark, shoot straight, and cross open country on foot without falling apart, the other being Renata. And Odessa knew she was going to need every one of those scarce, hard skills in the days coming down on us. Killing him would have felt like justice. In that first hot minute, it would have felt exactly like justice. And casting him out into that country with what was moving on the highway would have felt like a cleaner version of the same. But it would also have been one more thing lost. One more able body gone. From a group already down to the bone. And letting him stay, letting him sleep in the same room as the rest of us. Knowing he had looked at every one of our faces and privately sorted us into the ones worth saving and the ones worth spending, that felt like inviting the sickness itself in through the door and giving it a bunk and calling it a neighbor. Odessa asked the group. And the group, one face at a time, turned and looked at me. Because I was the one who'd walked in with him. The one who'd trained him, shadowed him, vouched for him at the wall with my own employee number. The one whose own words, or Odessa's words that I'd passed along and agreed with, he'd thrown back in all our faces as the justification for what he'd done. They wanted me to be the one who said it first, whatever it was going to be. So I'll ask you the same thing they asked me that night, before I tell you what I said, because I've carried the answer a long time now. And I still, to this hour, do not know for certain that it was the right one. He didn't raise a hand to a single person in that building. Every bit of harm he did with a key and a shelf and a piece of cold arithmetic in the dark. He took the margin, and the margin was Fenn Kessler's life, and maybe more before the end of it. But he was also 2 working hands and a steady eye and a strong back in a place that was going to need all 3 just to reach the next week. If you had been standing in that circle of headlamp light in the dead cold depot, with the water running out and the jugs and the highway droning low in the dark, and an old man's breath already going shallow in the next room, and Odessa Ray had turned her steady eyes on you, and asked you plainly, what should be done with Duval Crane, what would you have said? Cast him out into the country. Keep him, and never let him out of your sight. Something in between the two. Tell me in the comments, honestly. And tell me if you think I got it right. Because I have read 100 answers to that question over the time since. And I have never once found the one that lets me sleep the whole night through. I'll tell you what I said, and what it cost, and how it ended. Because you've come this far with me, and you've earned the whole of it. I said keep him. I said it slow, and I said it looking right at him. And I said it because I'm a man who does arithmetic too. The same cold arithmetic he'd used. And the arithmetic said plainly that we needed his hands and his back more than we needed the momentary satisfaction of being rid of the man. And because casting a living man out into that country in the dark was a death sentence, I did not want carried on the group's account, or on mine, no matter what he had done, and no matter that he deserved worse. Odessa heard me all the way out, and she nodded once, and then she made her own ruling. And it was harder than mine, and a great deal smarter. And it's the reason I've come to respect her memory more than almost anyone I've known. Keep him, yes, she said. But he stood no watch alone, ever again. He carried no key to anything. Not the cage, not the door, not the fuel, nothing. He did the worst and heaviest work in the whole camp from first light to last. And the very worst of it, once Renata found us the windmill, was hauling water. 2 miles north to the stock tank and 2 miles back, loaded over and over, day after day, feeding the group he had tried to make smaller. And there was someone with him every minute of every hour, not as a partner and not as a friend, but as a guard, a set of eyes, a witness. And the whole group knew. Every one of them knew exactly what he had done, and exactly why he was still drawing breath among us. And I think in the end, that was the real punishment. Harder than exile, and harder than anything a rope could have done. He lived among people who all knew, and none of whom would meet his eyes, and none of whom would say his name, unless they had to. And he had to get up in the gray cold every single morning and go earn a place he had already thrown away, and earn it again and again, and never once finish earning it, forever. He hauled water for the very group he had tried to lighten by 2 mouths, and then by however many the shortage would have taken. That was Odessa's justice, and I've come around, over the long time since, to thinking it was as close to right as anything that was actually available to us in that building on that night. Not mercy. He got no mercy. Not punishment. Not the kind that ends. Just the debt he owed, made into something physical, weighed out in liters and miles, and never, ever paid off in full. We survived, most of us. The windmill saved us, standing up there on the rise, turning its slow, patient wheel on the strength of a wind that never quit, filling that stock tank drop by drop while the country came apart everywhere else. Renata's knowledge of the ground saved us. The arroyos she knew that let a person move north to the tank without ever showing a silhouette to the highway. We stayed at Pumpville through the worst of it. Through the weeks when the drone on Highway 90 rose and fell and rose again. And then through the single worst night, when the drone finally and terribly went quiet all at once, and stayed quiet. And none of us said out loud what a whole highway of engines going silent at the same time might mean. And through the longer, stranger weeks after that, when the country belonged to the wind and the sick and the sun and us. And we learned to live in it because there was no other choice on offer. The reserve Duval had hidden, we never found the whole of it. Some things a man takes to wherever he ends up. But 2 months on, well past the windmill, out in the mud at the bottom of a dry earthen tank that the season's one rain had briefly filled and then given back to the sky. Boone's boy Wade found a case of sealed water sunk down and wrapped careful in a green tarp, staked so it wouldn't float, hidden by hands that had thought about it hard. And every one of us knew whose hands had done it, and not one person said a single word. And we carried it back, and we drank it. And I have never forgotten the taste of that water. It tasted like nothing. It tasted like water. It tasted like the thing a man had decided he valued more than the life of Fen Kessler. I still don't fully understand what happened to the trains that first afternoon. Why the tangent was empty when every law I trusted said it could not be. But I think now, after all of it, that the answer is the plainest one there ever was, and that the plainest answer is nearly always the true one. The crews west of me had already stopped, already begun cutting their trains apart, already started building the wall. In the very hour that I was climbing up onto that catwalk, with a torque wrench in my hand, thinking about the 610 out of Sanderson, what I saw as an impossible absence, a hole punched in the physics of my whole working life, was just people. People a little ahead of me on the track and a little ahead of me in their understanding, who had grasped the shape of the thing that was coming an hour before I did, and had already set about doing the only thing there was to do, which was to stop waiting for the system to tell them what came next and start deciding it themselves. And that is the part that has stayed with me, more than the sickness, more than the drone on the highway, more even than the morning we buried Fen Kessler in the hard ground behind the depot with Boone's boy crying and Odessa reading from the one book anybody had. It's that every wrong thing that happened at Pumpville came up out of the exact same root as every single right thing. Odessa built a fort out of a stopped train because she stopped waiting for the system to save her. Duval Crane built himself a private reserve out of the group's water because he stopped waiting too. The same instinct, the same cold, clear look at what was really there instead of what was supposed to be there. The system quits, you stop waiting, you look at what you've got, and you build something out of it. Those were good words. They kept us alive. And they were the exact words a man used to justify letting an old teacher die of thirst. The only question in them, the whole question, the one I have decided, is the only question that truly matters when everything else has fallen down and the radio's gone to dead air hiss, is not whether you build. It's what you build and who you build it for. Duval built it for himself. Odessa built it for all of us. And a man named Fen Kessler, who kept a careful count with a carpenter's pencil and a tiny dot on every can lid, died in the narrow, dark space between those two answers. And there was not one thing I could do about it by the time I understood what I was looking at. I keep the shotgun by the door still, wherever the door happens to be these days. I still stand the watch most nights, out of a habit that has outlived any real need for it, though I tell myself the need could come back any hour. And when the wind comes up off the low country in the dark, cold and out of its season the way it did that first afternoon on the bridge, I still find myself turning to look west down whatever line I can see, half expecting the twin lights of a train that isn't coming, on a track that hasn't felt the weight of one in a long, long time. It's the one wrong thing I never did explain to my own satisfaction. And I think some part of me is still up on that catwalk with the wrench going cold in my hand, looking down 11 miles of empty rail, waiting for the thing that was there to be there again. This was a hard one to tell, and I thank you for staying with it all the way to the end. If you have ever had to weigh what a person's betrayal was worth against what you still needed from that same person to keep going, then you already know there is no clean answer waiting at the bottom of it, and I would be glad to hear what yours turned out to be down in the comments. Stay safe out there. Keep your margin, and keep it for the right people.